Next week.
I have 10 fingers, 10 toes, 2 eyes, 1,000 of hair. But do you know what the world only has one of? Me.
They'd been on the ocean for nearly 3 weeks. This was their first sight of land. Everyone on board felt relief. It had been a long journey for the children, but now they could see for sure the land was close. Now, they were at the edge of their world. The whole horizon was glowing with the cloud that told them they were near land. This was going to be a big island, a big, bright, shining world. These are the first migrants, Polynesian settlers. The beginning of a long line of migrants to find these shores and to make New Zealand home. Later migrants would come further, but they would all bring some of their old worlds with them. And over time, the people and the land would be transformed. The forest would one day be replaced by cities. Ancient trees would make way for grass to feed sheep. Empty valleys would hum with the sound of traffic and people. And history would leave its marks on the landscape. To this distant frontier, immigrants would bring their dreams of new and better lives. These people would become New Zealanders. And this is our story. In the 1940s, most of New Zealand was focused on the Second World War. As part of the war effort, a man named Harold Wellman was sent to search for mineral resources on the west coast. In his younger days, Harold had prospected for gold, and he once walked over half the length of the South Island. And Harold Wellman made an extraordinary discovery about our past.
I always regard Harold as one of New Zealand's real intellectuals, but he didn't get his ideas from books. He got them from what he could see in the world around him and the questions he asked all the time.
He could be quite aggressive, he could be abrupt. He was interested in talking on any topic under the sun.
Harold was one of those people that loved an argument, and he had little time for people that accepted everything in the world around him and didn't want to discuss it and argue it. He was the Socrates of natural science in New Zealand.
In 1941, Harold was studying the geology of the South Island. There he found an immense geological fracture east of the Southern Alps. It ran for almost 700 kilometers. He called it the Alpine Fault. Wellman had found the South Island was split from Fiordland to Nelson.
He noticed this enormous break along the foot of the Southern Alps, which was a giant fault line. And so he plotted it on a map and came up with the concept of the Alpine Fault.
Then he made an even stranger discovery. He found that the top of the South Island had once been alongside the bottom. Two places, one in the Nelson Mineral Belt and one in Otago, both coincidentally called Red Hills, had once been part of the same ancient geological formation that was separated by the Alpine Fault.
When he had the idea, he took a pair of scissors and cut a geological map up and moved the north down to the south and saw that these older rocks matched, and that in between them, where this great fault was cutting and abutting, were the Southern Alps.
Harold Wellman saw that New Zealand was sliding along the Alpine Fault at about 42 millimetres a year. That's the rate our fingernails grow. His discovery would explain why New Zealand is prone to earthquakes and fractured by geothermal hotspots. For years, his ideas and extraordinary insights were rejected. But in the 1960s, science finally caught up with him when it was recognized that the surface of the Earth does move and deform. It floats on huge tectonic plates. This is what Harold Wellman had seen in the South Island. And what he was also witnessing was the latest chapter in the story of the creation of New Zealand itself. 130 million years ago, we were attached to a supercontinent called Gondwana.
New Zealand used to be part of a mega landmass, which included South Africa, India, Australia, South America, Antarctica, and us. We were always on the edge of it. We were always marginal. It's important to realise New Zealand's always been at the edges of things.
And 130 million years ago, New Zealand was a different place from what it is now. It was the age of dinosaurs. We lay close to the South Pole, and the temperatures were warm and moist. Today, dinosaur hunter Joan Whiffen excavates the fossils of the ancient creatures from the bush inland from Napier. Their bones have to be cut from solid rock. But when dinosaurs walked this terrain, New Zealand was still forming. Hawke's Bay was underwater and had its own Jurassic Park of marine reptiles. And the creature Joan is hacking from the rock was strolling along a beach. This was when the New Zealand as we know it began. Around 80 million years ago, the Tasman Sea began to form, and New Zealand began a journey north. We ended up over 2,000 kilometres from Australia and Antarctica, a remote and lonely island.
Three things happened to the New Zealand landmass. It became cooler. When it became cooler, it became denser. That means it started to sink. There was also erosion. So the mountains that we had inherited from Gondwana wore down slowly over that period. So the landmass became much lower. And the sea level started to rise globally. So all of those things gradually whittled New Zealand down.
New Zealand became an isolated cluster of low-lying islands, an archipelago. Our journey was almost done. But we ended that journey straddling a battle zone. The North Island and part of the South Island sit on the Indo-Australian plate. The South Island east of the Alpine Fault is on the Pacific plate. And the plates are grinding against one another. This high-pressure zone produces volcanoes, earthquakes, and mountains. 26 million years ago, the plates converged to begin a staggering act of mountain building called the Kaikoura Orogeny.
The mountain building period in New Zealand, which gave rise to the landscape we have today, it's a result of changes in the movement and increasing movement on the plate boundaries between the Australian plate and the Pacific plate, which are the dynamic underpinning of New Zealand.
The spine of New Zealand was uplifted from the sea and mountains were born. This is New Zealand's erogenous zone. The process is still happening today. The rocks that recently fell from the top of Aoraki Mount Cook were under the sea only 1 million years ago. And only 600 years ago, Rangitoto appeared almost overnight on the Auckland horizon. It was witnessed by people living nearby. Auckland City still sits on an active volcanic field. The existing cones probably won't erupt again, but experts believe there will be new volcanoes in the future. So we live on the edge, and the tectonic stresses beneath the ground often rush to the surface. But 800 years ago, on the eve of first contact with humans, most of the trembling was over. What was New Zealand like then? What did this last and loneliest place in the world have in store for the first migrants? For millions of years, New Zealand had been adrift on ancient seas. By journey's end, the country was an archipelago of islands, thousands of kilometers from our nearest major neighbor. We were isolated and remote, so our flora and fauna evolved in strange ways.
New Zealand was, I've described it as an alternative universe. Nearly everything in New Zealand has migrated here at some point. Everything that either had to swim, had to float, had to fly or drift.
Originally, we'd been part of the supercontinent Gondwana. And when we left, some things came with us. Ancient mosses and ferns came along. Kauri may have been one of the old originals. Vertebrates too, like the tuatara came. It's the last descendant of an ancient group of reptiles. But one of our animal icons that wasn't here from the start was the kiwi. It was a later arrival. It made its way to New Zealand 70 million years ago by island hopping from the north. It had to cross water and may actually have flown here. New Zealand has always been a destination for migrants. But everything that arrives here must be able to survive on the surface of the ocean for weeks or travel by air for days. This is one of the reasons New Zealand lacks many animals, like big land mammals, or tortoises, or snakes.
New Zealand was the only large mammal-free area in the globe. It was virtually unique in that it didn't have much in the way of ground-based predators. Under those circumstances, animals tend to live longer. They're not as constrained to breed quickly and reproduce. So they tend to have very long juvenile periods. And under those circumstances, they can reach a very large body size.
And without mammal predators, New Zealand became a land of giants.
One of the most unusual things about the New Zealand fauna is gigantism. A large number of our animals have very big body sizes.
Many insects descended to the forest floor and became flightless, sluggish, and huge. The giant leaf-eating weta can be up to 8.5 centimeters long. It's among the largest insects in the world. Our carnivorous snails can be up to 11 centimeters across. They thrived without mammals to eat them. New Zealand, before humans, was dense with trees. The forest canopy covered almost all the landscape from Stewart Island to Cape Reinga. Today we're used to a New Zealand countryside with broad open vistas, rolling hills and open valleys. This is almost entirely made by man.
We're used to images of New Zealand which include pasture land, include waving tussock fields, and we kind of think that it might have been like that all the time. In fact, it wasn't. It was something like 95% covered, not only in forest, but in tall, dense forest.
And with all this forest, New Zealand was a land of birds. Hundreds of species filled the forest and shoreline. In New Zealand, birds took the place of those absent mammals. The kiwi, with its powerful burrowing and scratching feet, no wings and a cute sense of smell, acts more like a wombat or badger than a bird. Large fruit-eating birds like pigeon and kōkako fill the roles of possum and koala in Australia. One of our few land mammals, the short-tailed bat, had an unusual response to the lack of predators. It largely abandoned flight altogether to scuttle and climb across the forest floor to look for insect prey. Many of our birds are flightless or poor flyers. And like some of our other creatures, birds that didn't need to fly got big. The most astounding was the moa. There were many species of moa. Some were quite small, but the biggest moa, Dinornis, stood over 2 meters tall at the shoulder.
Moa are very funny. They're like the T-Rex of New Zealand. I have to say that I'm obsessed by moa in many ways. A particular focus of our research group has been moa and the diversity of moa. Our data at the moment would indicate that there are at least 15 species of moa. Range from very small things, not much bigger, for example, than a pukeko, right through to birds that were tall enough that they'd reach the ceiling.
Moa were first studied by a pioneering British anatomist called Richard Owen. He was the person who coined the name dinosaur, which meant terrible lizard. Owen theorised the existence of moa from a small bone that had been sent to him from New Zealand. He called them Dinornis, terrible bird. Early museum displays exaggerated the big bird's posture by exhibiting specimens with necks at full stretch. Scientists now think the birds walked with their heads forward and held out in front. One of the most unexpected aspects of moa physiology is the recent discovery that females were much bigger and brawnier than the males.
In one group, the Dinornis group of moa, the females were in fact roughly about twice the size of males.
Moa were one of the most predominant creatures in our prehistoric landscape. But if the moa was the biggest herbivore, it was not the top of the food chain. It had one predator, a ferocious eagle, the largest eagle the world has ever seen. Haast's eagle was gigantic. It weighed up to 13 kilograms and had an almost 3-meter wide wingspan. And this massive predator preyed on large birds that included full-grown moa. Haast's eagle was lord of the forest. Before human contact, these islands fairly teemed with life. New Zealand was a land empty of people, but soon our frontier would be crossed. Far to the north, in tropical waters, human history was on the move. Ancient migrants were carrying their culture into southern seas. Soon, they would find our ocean, and our islands would never be the same again. About 3,500 years ago, a meeting took place on a beach in the Bismarck Archipelago in the Western Pacific. The locals had seen a sail pierce the horizon. It meant the presence of strangers. The strangers were colonists, and they would change the lives of the people who met them. They were seafarers and explorers, and in their canoes they carried an exotic cargo of plants and animals. We call their descendants the Lapita people. The Lapita people were the ancestors of the people of Polynesia, and the direct ancestors of the people who would one day become Maori. The Lapita people were skilled sailors, and they'd been sailing between islands for generations. Their story is the start of a great saga of human exploration. About 4,000 years ago, the ancestors of the Lapita people left their ancient home in Taiwan or southern China and migrated south through the islands of Southeast Asia. After generations of traveling, they arrived on that beach in the Bismarck archipelago and began to mix with the locals. Recently, one of the oldest Lapita villages was discovered in Vanuatu. It's being excavated by New Zealand and Australian archaeologists, and they've made an extraordinary discovery. They found a cemetery containing many bodies. Some of the bodies were in strange positions, and they were all headless. The place is called Tioma, and it's hoped the pots and other objects found in the graves will tell the archaeologists something about the lives of these first settlers of Vanuatu. And most intriguing are their strange burial practices.
As well as burying people just laid out in various positions, including very unusually people buried face down, which is kind of rare all over the world. There was also seemed to have buried at least parts of people, a skull in one case and some other bones in another case, inside a decorated Lapita pot. And this is the first time ever found in the Pacific. And it links, to my mind at least, back to Southeast Asia. It's the ancestral culture of the Lapita people.
It's hard to know how these early inhabitants of the Pacific lived. But this rare film from Papua New Guinea, where they settled before they came to Vanuatu, can give us a good idea. Lapita people were Neolithic people. They had no metals, but they mastered stone for tools. This knowledge of working stone would be important for Maori when they settled their new islands. The objects found at the excavation will tell the scientists what the people were like when they lived there.
We know that they were people who had an agricultural lifestyle. They're growing yams, taros, keeping pigs and chickens. In some ways would have borne a great resemblance to the kind of agricultural lifestyle of many people in the Pacific, at least until the recent past.
Many of the plants that are icons of the Pacific today, like coconut and banana, were taken there by Lapita colonists. Everywhere the Lapita people went, they made gardens, and they altered the landscape through which they passed. This would be a theme of expansion throughout the Pacific and New Zealand. People would change the landscape by clearing forests, burning bush, and planting crops. The Lapita people transformed rainforest into highly productive gardens. The excavation tells the scientists how the people coped with their environment.
Here,
and they can see how tough life was in the prehistoric Pacific.
They suffered a lot of injuries during their lifetime, I think just from sort of hard work and accidents, get broken legs, broken arms on occasion. And also the hard life they led meant that many of them developed these degenerative diseases like arthritis, rheumatism, a lot of physical activity, working in the gardens. Also, a lot of them had very strong upper arm muscles, and that, we think, probably comes from a lot of canoe paddling. The Lapita people, as we know, were the great voyagers of the Pacific. So there's some evidence, I think, of that we can see in the bones themselves.
No one knows exactly what Lapita canoes were like, but by the time they reached Vanuatu, they must have been expert sailors. They'd already set up communities and trading networks in island Southeast Asia. They'd shared their genes and culture with the people they'd found there. And Lapita culture was merging into a new Pacific culture. But the thing that really sets the Lapita people apart is their exquisite pottery. They were the finest potters the Pacific has ever seen. Thousands of pieces of pottery have been found in places where Lapita people lived. They made pots in all shapes and sizes, and they were decorated with intricate patterns. The pottery designs may have originally been used for textiles or tattoos. Today, these women from the Singatoka Valley in Fiji are just about the last people to make pots in the traditional way. They don't use a potter's wheel, and they still make the patterns by cutting them into the soft clay. In a similar way, the Lapita potters stamped their pots with patterns before firing them. The best Lapita pots were things of beauty. The intricate designs would have taken time and skill, and this made them special. And Lapita pots weren't used for cooking or for storing food.
The use of these pots, they're clearly not for cooking. They're not highly fired, they're highly decorated, and so they've certainly, there's no question they had a ceremonial use.
If Lapita pots weren't used for storing food, they could be used for storing something else. Throughout the Pacific, people often have a reverence for the human head. In some places, the heads of ancestors became part of daily life. For Maori, the head would become the most tapu part of the body. But in Vanuatu, the dead weren't always left to rest in peace.
This is an example of a skeleton of a person who's been buried, and then later on the people from the community have come back and they've removed the skull from the grave. So this here is actually the neck vertebra. So the head should be sitting about in this position here.
After probably a year or so of decomposition, people are revisiting the graves and removing the skulls to be placed, in one case, in the pot there. Our interpretation of this is that it's demonstrating reverence to the heads of those people that have died.
One of the great legacies of the Lapita people to the Pacific was the language they spoke. Their language was part of a huge family of languages called Austronesian. Austronesian includes 1/5 of the world's spoken languages. It's spoken from Taiwan in Asia to Madagascar off the coast of Africa. All Polynesian languages, including Maori, belong to it. That's why many modern languages have similar words for similar things. The Maori word waka for canoe comes from the same word as vaka for canoe in the Cook Islands, or va'a in Tahiti. And what the scientists are learning in Vanuatu will help us understand more about Pacific people today.
What we're finding in this skeletal sample has quite far-reaching implications for how we interpret the health of Polynesian populations today, and in New Zealand and also in the greater Polynesian archipelagos.
Over time, the world of the Lapita colonists began to change. They would sail out again into the Pacific to find Samoa and Tonga. Their culture would evolve into something new and unique. What would emerge would be the distinctive culture of Polynesia. Then, around 2,000 years ago, they would sail once more. exploring navigators would begin the most audacious voyages in their history. They would cross the vast Pacific Ocean. They would find the Cook Islands, Tahiti, Easter Island, and Hawaii. And eventually, they would find our islands as well. The Great Triangle that encloses Polynesia has sides nearly 6,500 kilometers long. At its northern point is Hawaii. Far to the east is Easter Island, and at its southern end, New Zealand. Within the triangle are a huge number of cultures with rich oral traditions, arts, and knowledge of the sea. The Polynesians had no metals, but their stone and wood carvings, adzes and tools combined art with function. Their monuments attest to the power of their chiefs, and their most enduring memorials still engage the imagination. And like their ancestors, the Polynesians were at home on the ocean.
Well, these people were sea people, and the sea was their road. And they fished on it, and they communicated over it, and it was always there as one of the major environmental themes.
They found most of the islands in the Pacific, and some intrepid Polynesian explorers must have sailed as far as South America. The Polynesians reached South America probably about 1,000 years ago. This was about the same time the Vikings from Europe arrived in North America.
The Polynesians almost certainly got to South America, and they brought back the sweet potato and the gourd, and we're getting accumulating evidence of a more substantial Polynesian contact on the American coast than what's been previously realised. So among the things which suggest Polynesians got there are people were making boats out of planks and tying them together with fibre, and in parts of South America, stone tools and ornaments that looked like some in parts of Polynesia and New Zealand.
What the Polynesians found in South America probably overawed and even intimidated them. They may have found exotic civilizations. They could have seen large cities and enormous numbers of people. South America was no empty island. And like the Vikings who encountered the native people of North America, the Polynesians returned to their canoes and sailed home. But they went home with evidence of their encounter. They carried back cargoes of kumara and gourd. Kumara would become one of the most important things that they would eventually take to New Zealand. Within eastern Polynesia, different cultures developed on different islands. But they all shared many things in common. In 1769, when James Cook made his voyage of discovery to New Zealand, the great naturalist Joseph Banks observed that the almost identical language and custom between these people meant they certainly came from the same source. Chiefs were the kingpins of Polynesian society. They controlled land and sometimes the distribution of food.
It was a kin-based society, or in most cases, and it's a ranked society, and so there were hierarchies of individuals and also of kin groups.
In a small society, everyone knew their place, and the closer you were to the chiefly line, the higher your rank was likely to be. This is why knowing your whakapapa, or genealogical connections, was important. Chiefs in Polynesia were usually men. They'd inherited their title from their father and would usually hand it on to their eldest son. They didn't amass wealth like European kings, but distributed any wealth they had around the community. Chiefs were often imbued with a kind of mystical power that was sometimes called mana. Their possessions were often tapu, or taboo. and Polynesian chiefs were often ambitious and warfare was endemic. Territorial disputes were common, and dynasties often rose and fell rapidly. Some Polynesian societies had very formal organisation. They had classes with aristocracies almost like European kingdoms. The first Hawaiian king, Kamehameha, had unified almost all the Hawaiian islands under his personal rule. And Tonga easily transformed itself into a kingdom that survives today. Polynesians were great gardeners. The economy was based on intensive fishing and growing fruits and vegetables, and they became sophisticated agriculturalists.
There was some fairly specialised agriculture developed. Irrigated taro and dryland terraced sweet potato.
They had inherited many of their plants from their Lapita ancestors. Taro, yams, grapefruit and banana were grown everywhere. The coconut palm defined the Pacific landscape. It was an important plant for food, timber and ropes. And it may also have been taken by Polynesian people to Central America.
The coconut crossed the Pacific, but it's uncertain whether it drifted and germinated, if it could get upwind from island Polynesia without any help, or whether people took it. And there have been a few computer simulations which suggest it's more likely that people took it.
The kumara, once it had been imported from South America, thrived in cooler parts of the Pacific like northern New Zealand. Gardening in the Pacific was usually easy. The land, especially on the bigger islands, was often very fertile. The type of agriculture they practiced is sometimes called slash and burn. An area is cleared by slashing and burning off, then planted out and used before the gardeners moved on to another plot. The old vegetation then regrows in no time. This was successful in island Polynesia, but the first settlers to New Zealand would find the land would be slower to regenerate. Religion and spiritual ideas guided every aspect of life in Polynesia. The gods were everywhere. They imbued every aspect of life. Huge structures were often built to communicate with them. And these marae were both churches and parliaments. They were places of observance and the realm of priests. But they were also places where the community could be heard. When taken to New Zealand, the marae became more political than priestly. Many of the ideas, customs and values of Eastern Polynesian society would make their way to New Zealand with the ancestors of the Maori. The people who set out for New Zealand were not Maori. They may have been Marquesans, or Cook Islanders, or Tahitians, but over time, they would interact and harmonize with their new frontier. They would lose their old selves and become a new people in a new land. The Pacific is the world's largest ocean. From space, it covers almost the whole visible part of the globe. Its surface area is greater than the total land area of the Earth itself. And this was the ocean that was crossed first by ancient navigators. But how did those people find those tiny islands in this huge ocean? Today, the revival of ancient canoe sailing is helping to answer that question. For the first time in generations, the great canoe fleets can be seen again. And new tools are helping people relearn the old arts again.
Right, it's the tracing lines are off.
Stanley Conrad is the skipper of the New Zealand voyaging canoe Te Orere. Working on the canoe connects him directly to his ancestors and provides the ultimate challenge.
You're sort of sailing, you know, the way your ancestors would have sailed. The challenge when you voyage is actually finding land. It's the challenge of getting at it. It's a challenge of using the wind, using the natural elements around you to get you to a point where you left from, to a point where you're going to arrive. And all the signs that are out there to find land, it's exciting.
Hundreds of years ago, ancient canoes sailed towards an empty horizon. The sailors had no maps to plot their routes and no instruments for navigation. But they discovered and settled nearly all the land that was to be found in the Pacific Ocean. Some people have questioned how sailors in flimsy canoes could do this. One, a New Zealander named Andrew Sharp, said they couldn't. He said colonizing settlers were blown across the Pacific by storms. He said that settlement voyages were accidents, that people were just swept ashore on empty islands. Today, his ideas have been rejected.
Andrew Sharp was scrutinising the evidence available to him as a sort of a landlubber, and so he took a very conservative approach, and he basically got it wrong.
There was also the idea that the Polynesians came from South America. Thor Heyerdahl, in his experimental voyages from South America on the Kon-Tiki, succeeded in capturing the imagination of people.
Well, I think that the Kon-Tiki experiment showed that it was possible to drift from America with the prevailing winds, but it also showed that you couldn't get home again. And where it differs from Polynesian oceanic peoples' expansion is that they went the other way, in a direction from which they could return in the event of not finding land.
Although Polynesians reached South America to bring home the kumara, South America was not their original home. Deepwater Polynesian canoes were large, fast, and safe. Each island group had its own design. Canoes usually had 2 hulls in Polynesia and 1 hull with an outrigger in other places. They could be 20 meters long and were built of wood planks sewn together. In good conditions, traditional canoes could reach a speed of 8 knots, and they could average 100 sea miles over 24 hours. The New Zealand voyaging canoe, Te Aurere, has sailed thousands of kilometers into the Pacific, as far as Hawaii and the Marquesas Islands. It was built by Northland master carver Hector Busby to help Maori relearn the art of navigation. Skipper Stanley Conrad has deep respect for the knowledge of his ancestors.
They knew what they were doing, they knew where they were going to, they knew what the purpose of the voyage was, they knew how to prepare, they knew how to build, and they knew how to navigate. And you know, they actually, to me, the ocean was, they weren't afraid of the ocean. The ocean was part of their life.
When Te Aurere made its first major voyage to Rarotonga in 1992, it proved that it was possible to voyage from New Zealand back into the Pacific using only traditional navigation skills. And the greatest skill of the ancient navigator was his ability to read the sky. By day, he would read signs all around him: the state of the sea, the sun, clouds, and the movement of birds. By night, his eyes would be fixed on the stars.
You'll have to remember about 60 onto about 70 star rising points, and what time during the night they rose, and where they're going to travel to, or how they travel across the sky, or how they arc across the sky, and where they set.
The rising and setting points of bright stars and planets were memorized. The relationships between particular stars and known islands was trained into the minds of young navigators. The knowledge became memorized as a star compass that would guide navigators around their world as securely as any road map.
The canoe becomes the center point of your star compass. The horizon line is the circumference of your star compass, and the dome, or the sky above it, is the dome, the canoe being the center point on the direction you want to go to.
Major voyages would be timed for different seasons of the year. The navigators had a deep knowledge of the changing patterns of winds and currents and timed voyages to coincide with preferred weather patterns.
I knew at a certain time of the year the trade winds would be blowing in a direction that they wanted to go to. So they use those trade winds, even the currents, using the movement, the migrating of the seabirds, because that would have been one of the ideal things to use to know that when it's time to sail south or sail north, is the migratory birds. Migratory birds or mammals wouldn't travel anytime they wanted. They would travel where the current was running, so it wouldn't be a hard journey for them.
And for the navigator, the voyage could be a lonely task.
A lot of the time you're by yourself. Physically, you've got to be very prepared. In the spiritual side, you've got to prepare yourself within. Mentally, you've got to be prepared. That you're, because really you're virtually carrying a lot on your shoulders when you do become a navigator.
Lift up towards me. Yep.
You've got to try and stay awake as much as you can. You've got to sort of what we call catnapping.
When it was too overcast to see much, the sailors would use other aids. In the Pacific, the prevailing winds push up swells that roll in a constant direction for most of the year. Navigators would keep the canoe at a particular angle to the swell. A change in the motion of the canoe or a change in the sound of the waves lapping on her sides would mean that they'd change direction. But there's still one big mystery about how the Polynesians settled the Pacific. In the tropics, prevailing winds come from the east, but the settlers were sailing from the west. They were sailing against the prevailing trade winds. Jeff Irwin's been studying the seasonal patterns of winds in the Pacific.
The Peter went in the direction that was upwind, and by going upwind, they gave themselves the opportunity to come home. I think it was a strategy for discovery and survival, because that was obviously the best way to explore, to find and survive. So it does seem very rational.
So for generations, explorers used seasonal winds to sail against the direction of the trade winds. They used the seasonal westerlies to look for land and were blown back home by the easterlies after they'd found it. Many voyages in the Pacific would have been indirect. On a long journey, they used stepping stones. This was how New Zealand was probably discovered. The first explorers probably got here by using stepping stone islands like Norfolk Island and the Kermadec. These islands show evidence that they'd been settled, but then abandoned.
Stepping stones were really important in maintaining communication between islands that were already settled, because the story didn't actually end when the islands were first settled, because people went on communicating. They went back to where they came from, they set up trading routes between islands, and so the stepping stones were really quite important.
The stepping stone islands were also important once New Zealand had been settled. They could also have been available for stopovers on return voyages back to Polynesia. The Stepping Stone Islands show that it's possible that Maori made return voyages back to the Pacific. By about 800 years ago, all 3 points of the Polynesian Triangle had been discovered. And New Zealand could have been discovered long before it was settled. Sometime, about 800 years ago, our first settlers were preparing to leave for their journey south. Like the people who had moved across the Pacific before them, they would carry their whole worlds with them. Their animals, their plants, the ideas in their heads, and one another. They would discover what would be the last frontier on the Pacific Ocean, and the last place on Earth for people to settle. They would be the first people to leave their footprints on the land. And they would be the beginning of our story. The first people to find New Zealand had arrived at the edge of their world. They were colonists, They'd set out to find a new land to settle, and now they found the largest island they'd ever seen. This place was thick with virgin forest and ringing with the sound of 1 million birds. This was the last place on Earth to be settled by humans, and it was a place overflowing with riches. The first explorers would find a huge land. There would be strange creatures and monsters from the sky. Tribes would grow. The landscape would be transformed, and the people would come to call themselves Tangata Whenua, the people of the land. Who were these people? Where did they settle? And how would they transform their newfound treasure islands? Nobody knows exactly when the first Polynesian people arrived in New Zealand, and nobody knows exactly where they landed. But they came to colonize. The waka carried men and women and children, and there were animals and plants for new gardens. They may have been following sailing directions from explorers who had found these islands and returned home to pass on the knowledge. Their voyage had been guided by a navigator who had used stars, sea currents, and a flight of birds to bring them to this southern latitude. These migrants had been on the sea for perhaps 3 or 4 weeks. The voyage had taken both courage and skill. But now it was over. The colonists would leave their footprints on a virgin land. The year is about 1250. Europe is in the Middle Ages. And it would be 500 years before Captain Cook would come this far south. The land that the Polynesians found would be a spectacular surprise.
When they arrived, they must have been amazed. This land was just full of food. There were large flightless birds in the understories. There were pigeons, there were kaka, there were shellfish, and fish that had never been hunted or taken before. It must have been the prehistoric equivalent of winning the lottery.
The trip from East Polynesia would have been relatively quick. The plant seedlings they brought with them, the sweet potato or kumara, the yam and taro, would have easily survived the journey. They probably also bought Asian mulberry for tapa cloth and gourds for storage. But the coconuts and bananas wouldn't grow in the colder climate of New Zealand. They probably also brought some domestic animals from home, chickens, dogs, and pigs. But like some of the plants, the pigs and chickens didn't survive in New Zealand. There was also another passenger on the waka, the Pacific rat, the kiore. These creatures would be the first in a long line of exotic animals to be introduced here. But how can we be sure these people weren't just blown here by accident? And how can we be sure they intended to stay? Professor David Penny has been studying the DNA of Maori in order to understand these first arrivals better. He believes the voyage was well planned.
There had to be prior knowledge, explorers being to New Zealand, finding it, taking the knowledge back, and then deliberate settlement. There was no way that we could explain it in terms of an accidental fishing canoe blown off course and, you know, arriving exhausted on New Zealand just by luck.
One of the first things the Polynesians did in New Zealand was explore. The new arrivals found the land beyond their wildest dreams. It was full of strange creatures, and would be the home of new gods. There were mountain ranges stretching hundreds of kilometers, lakes as big as atolls, and rivers wider than a reef. Like all migrants, these people gave new names to the new things they encountered. Many of their names came from back home. They would make the new land seem familiar, more friendly. This red flower was called after a flower from the islands. They called it Puhutakawa. And the explorers must have come from a warm place because they had no words for cold things. When they encountered snow, they called it hukarere, the sailor's word for flying foam. Hail became uafata, stone rain. Their new food source, the seal, was named for its most obvious characteristic, kekeno, a look around. And the Polynesian word for a large, fierce shark became the taniwha. Within a century of arriving, the new settlers had explored and named the whole country. But where did they first land? The settlers' first landfall was almost certainly on the east coast of the North Island. Locations favoured by archaeologists are North Cape or Coromandel. And the reenactment voyages made by replica canoes in the 20th century suggest that if a canoe starts a voyage near Tahiti, wind and currents will drive it towards the east coast. And the only object known to have come with the settlers, a pearl shell fishing lure, was found near Coromandel. Most Maori tribes have their own tradition about where canoes might have arrived on the coast. Many communities identify closely with a particular waka. Winston Waititi is from the Eastern Bay of Plenty. His waka, Tauera Mai Tawhiti, is remembered at his marae. Understanding ancestors is still important for Maori today, and arrival stories are part of the tribe and its history. The traditional landing sites of waka are important tribal landmarks.
They would have come in here and dispersed. Another waka, Tauera Mai Tawhiti, that one belonged to one of our ancestors called Pou Mātangatanga, and he plays a very prominent part in our history. And his waka landed, or came in here as well. But unfortunately, there's a rock that he crashed into. And then they had to finish their journey swimming.
Being associated with a waka connects a tribe to an area and promotes a strong sense of belonging. There are many stories of many waka, but the founding population was probably very small. David Penny uses modern genetic science to estimate the number of immigrants in the founding population. He compared the unique DNA sequences of Maori people with other DNA from around the Pacific.
We looked at other people from eastern Polynesia, and that is going from Easter Island through Hawaii, through to Tahiti. So that really gave us a study comparing what we had in New Zealand, comparing what was in eastern Polynesia, and then just running it through the computer probably 100,000 times to get a good average.
From the DNA, he can work out how many women arrived.
Our conclusion was that the number of females in the founding population size was somewhere between 50 and 100. Our best estimate is 70.
And with about 70 women in the founding population, David estimates there would have been around 100 or 200 people altogether. David Penny's findings also support the idea that the first arrivals were organised colonists, because they brought with them enough women to begin a viable new population. He argues that bringing women on the expedition meant the voyagers knew something about where they were going and something about the place they would find when they arrived. Bringing women meant the group was coming to stay. It's likely that several different canoes arrived from several different islands over about 100 years. But exactly when the first settlers arrived is difficult to pinpoint. And some unusual evidence is being used to fix a date. It's not the evidence left by the migrants themselves, but by a stowaway that hitchhiked all the way from East Polynesia. The Kiore couldn't have come to New Zealand by itself. It had to have come with people. Scientist Janet Wilmshurst searched for evidence about when it arrived by looking at what it ate. And its favourite food was from the miro tree.
This is a miro seed, and you can see quite distinctive chisel marks from the incisors where the Kiore has nibbled open this hard nutlet to access the nut inside. Kiore were brought to New Zealand by voyaging people, and they don't swim very well, and they couldn't have made it on their own. So basically, a rat gnawed seed provides earliest evidence for the presence of rat, and therefore the presence of people.
Carbon dating of the seeds shows the Kiore were here eating them in the middle of the 13th century, somewhere around the year 1250. And since Kiore came with people, that helps date their arrival as well. When they arrived, and wherever they landed, the first colonists found a land of plenty. But New Zealand is a fragile paradise, and the colonists would have to learn a lot before they could find the hidden treasures of these islands. And sometimes, that education would take generations to learn. When the Polynesians arrived here, much of the country was covered in dense forest. It was thick and teeming with life. Birds had almost no natural predators and knew no fear. Many had long ago lost the ability to fly. And in this new world of extremes, even the birds were bigger than anything the Polynesians had ever known. A banquet on legs. One more could feed a family for a couple of weeks. But the Moa weren't the only monsters in New Zealand's primeval bush. Another huge bird, a winged warrior, struck fear into the hearts of man. This giant killing machine, Haast's eagle, was New Zealand's airborne equivalent of a saber-toothed tiger.
The eagle was the biggest eagle ever in the world, and literally its talons are the same size as lions and immensely powerful.
This Moa pelvis has holes where an eagle attacked it.
It was able to just land on the back of a moa, and the talons would penetrate right through into the vital organs, especially the kidney, which lies under the pelvis, and basically the birds would bleed to death.
Young Maori would have learned to fear this predator.
Humans are a little biped, and so if an eagle did happen on an unsuspecting child, then I would think it'd be easily killed.
But whatever the dangers, the forest was still rich in food. Almost every species of bird was eaten by the Maori, but each bird had its own individual habits, and many ways had to be devised to catch them. Ricky Bennett has reconstructed some of the old bird traps to see how effective they were.
This bird trap here is a koropa manu. It was made out of pirita and also harakeke. Normally the bait that we used would be berries, karamu, sometimes poroporo. They would try and imitate the sounds of the different birds using leaves, sometimes grasses. You can actually imitate the sound of a distress call of the tui.
And as Kiore flourished in its new home, it became an important food here, just as it was in the Pacific.
This particular kind of trap was set on a Kiore run, which was a track which was made by a Kiore through constant use. The trap would be built without it being set. And the kiore would get used to passing through it. The idea is that it would step through the noose and it will stand on the kurupai, which is the horizontal stick at the base, which actually releases the taratara, which is the vertical stick running down. So just pretending that my stick is a kiore.
When the first settlers arrived on the coast, it was fur seals that provided the easiest food supply. They were here in huge numbers and easily killed. But so many were killed that their numbers soon fell. It took time for the colonists to realize that even large populations of animals could be overhunted. Perhaps the tragedy of New Zealand settlement was the demise of one of our most remarkable birds, the moa.
They would appear to have no fear, and Maori could probably stalk them without much effort at all, walk up to them and spear them with simple wooden spears or clubs.
Moa lived in every kind of environment, and Maori hunted them everywhere in the country, especially on the South Island's east coast. On the Wairau Bar in Marlborough, Maori set up a huge moa hunter village. Over just a few years, they butchered up to 12,000 moa here.
It took only a very short time to exterminate moa. In a given catchment, it might have only taken 10 years in some places, 50 years in others. Over the whole country, I think we're talking of no more than 200 years till the last moa was gone.
Population decline happened so quickly, Maori had no time to develop conservation strategies. In just 2 centuries, the moa was extinct, the victim of its own lack of defences and slow rate of reproduction. And once its main food was gone, Haast's eagles soon followed. The actions of humans and introduced animals sometimes had a devastating effect on the landscape. By the time Europeans arrived, many of New Zealand's native birds were extinct. When the first settlers arrived, New Zealand was covered with bush, from the mountains to the coast. But within a few decades, much of the bush was gone. By the time Captain Cook arrived a few hundred years later, over half the country's forests had been burnt off. This totara tree on Banks Peninsula was part of a burn-off 600 years ago.
There have been all sorts of fanciful reasons for why they might have burnt, but once it's cleared, you have faster turnover in the scrub, you have a range of birds that live in that scrub, wetlands suddenly spring into life because the woody cover's been removed, and so land that was just, if you like, a monotonous cover of forest becomes a living sort of food basket.
The burnt-over scrub encouraged a new plant to grow. It was bracken fern, and it would become one of this country's most important foods.
The edible part of the plant was the rhizome, which is an underground branch. It was immensely important to the Maori because it was one of the few sources of wild starch that they could get hold of. They could dry it for long-term storage, roast it, then beat it out and get the fibres out of it and make cakes.
But eating bracken fern would ruin people's teeth, and this would harm their health. The first people to arrive here were hunters and gatherers. They lived off the bounty of the virgin land. They were also gardeners and horticulturalists. But in New Zealand, gardening would give the early colonists a short, sharp shock. This is the Wairarapa coast, near Wellington. When the first settlers arrived here, the place was covered in bush, but the settlers cut it down to make kumara gardens. The stone walls they left behind are still in the ground today. But clearing the bush here would give the new arrivals an unexpected lesson in local agriculture. The stone fences you can see as parallel lines running down to the sea probably started out as single lines of boundary stones. As the fields were cleared, the stones were piled up, creating the walls.
Some of these gardens are hundreds of years old. This particular one where we are now has a radiocarbon date that puts it back at about AD 1300. So people were gardening here right at the beginning of settlement in this area, and the walls are still here. They would grow the individual plants in little low mounds called puke and plant one plant in each one. It makes it a little bit warmer. You get the sun on the sides of the mound, and it also provides a bit of drainage for the plant.
But the cleverness of the kumara agriculture had a damaging effect on the Wairarapa coast. The first settlers expected crops to grow as they'd done in the Pacific, with many crops a year and fast regenerating gardens. In New Zealand, gardens were seasonal, and the bush clearances for gardens encouraged erosion. Later generations would also find New Zealand eroded easily. It took the first settlers some time to understand their treasure islands. Now the problem was how to store the kumara over the winter. And to do that, they mastered a new technology, the climate-controlled storage rua. Janet is part of a team experimenting with kumara storage on the site of ancient kumara pits in the Wairau Valley. They've built this rua, a roofed underground pit, to see how kumara survive.
They had to be able to keep them not only to eat, but to save enough to plant again in the spring. And that was a long period to store any kind of root vegetable under New Zealand conditions.
The stakes were high. The price of failure was starvation. But as one generation followed another, the people did adapt to the country. And after a few hundred years, they had mastered all it had to offer. And this can be seen near Matata in the Bay of Plenty. In 1974, the remains of an ancient village were found there. The village of Kohika is considered one of the best preserved archaeological wet sites in the world. Its discovery was the start of a 30-year investigation led by archaeologist Geoffrey Irwin.
This was a location that brought high rewards but carried high risks. And the rewards were accessibility, canoe transport, and the risks were earthquakes and floods. And the people there had both.
Kohika was occupied by the Ngāti Awa tribe in the 17th century. The people here harvested bracken fern, speared birds, and cultivated fertile soils. They fished and also had time to carve houses and a canoe. They ate whales, dogs, and also possibly people. By this time, the people who lived here were completely adapted to life in New Zealand.
If we were sitting in Kohika now, we could see a small island with a light palisade around it, and there would have been houses with thatched insulation and patika, raised storehouses and cooking shelters, and canoes drawn up on the shore.
While the ordinary people lived in simple houses, the chief lived in a fine carved house. Rod Wallace has revealed the skill with which it was constructed.
This is a rafter, or a heki, and it joined together in a mortise and tenon joint with the popo. All the connecting is on the outside of the structure, and the inside is very plain.
The cables holding everything together passed through eyelets on the outside of the frame. When covered with thatching, the construction techniques were invisible.
They've put the lashings on the outside so that the inside of the house appears to be completely without any form of lashings whatsoever.
By the time Kohika was lived in, the people here were uniquely Maori. And when the Europeans arrived here in the 18th century, places like Tamaki Makaurau showed the full flowering of Maori culture. The rich marine resources of Auckland's two harbours and the fertile volcanic soils made it just as attractive to the first wave of settlers as it is today. Kumara fields were vast. They spread over 2,000 hectares, and small villages were dotted amongst the gardens. But as population pressures increased, so did conflicts. An epidemic of fortified power building followed. Each volcanic cone had at least one. Maunga Kia, or One Tree Hill, was first occupied at least 500 years ago. In times of war, 1,000 people may have found refuge here.
If we had come here 500 years ago, there would have been several hundred people living in Maori houses clustered around this particular place, clustered together at points on its slopes. This hill was, of course, fortified, extensively fortified. The settlement was built up over several centuries. Some archaeologists would suggest 500 or 600 years. The land around it was intensively cultivated and extremely well managed in the Maori tradition of cultivation, of course. And the crops on it were stored in the pits that we see here. Many of the trees around it would have been named, cropped for their berries. Almost every square inch of One Tree Hill is built. They did all of this with wooden tools and kits. They moved soil from higher elevations to lower elevations in order to make broader and broader terraces as one comes down the slope. There are tens of thousands of cubic metres of soil here which have been moved in pre-European time. It is a massive engineering undertaking. So from an archaeological point of view, this is one of the great made landscapes of the Pacific. This is a place of great power, a place worthy of great respect, and a place which has ancient mana. In the great Maori tradition, where status comes with elevation, with height, you have the highest defended part of the hill. It is behind concentric rings of fortification, and there special ceremonial ritual events occurred long before the Europeans came here. Now somewhat scarified with an obelisk and a car park, but nevertheless that is to be understood as one of the most sacred Maori places in New Zealand.
By now, Maori tribes had spread to every part of the country. The treasures of New Zealand were being unlocked, and the spiritual force of the land, its Maori, was being awakened. After hundreds of years of living in New Zealand, Maori had explored and exploited all the resources the country had to offer. The Polynesians lived in a world where stone took the place of metal. Here on D'Urville Island at the top of the South Island, they would set up an industrial operation turning rocks into adzes. This beach is made up of the chips left behind after an adze blade has been made. It's estimated there could still be 60 tons of stone flakes lying here. This would mean that over 15,000 adzes had been made here and exported to the rest of the country. It was a particular kind of stone called argillite.
It's hard. It's the second hardest type of stone in New Zealand, and it is perfect for making adzes. Toki, we call them toki.
Carver Leighton Hale uses the old techniques. Maori used large hammer stones to break off slices of smaller stones. Some of the hammer stones were so big, 2 men were needed to lift them.
This is the process called flaking. From that stage, you get to this stage, what we call hammer dressing. It's a long, slow process of picking at the rock.
Water acts as a lubricant for the smoothing process. Like flaking, grinding on sandstone requires great patience. It might take 200 hours to produce an adze. This grindstone was used by craftsmen for centuries to make large adzes. The grooves are still easy to see.
It's a living, breathing thing. It's not just a stone. It's not just a stone. They have character. They have integrity. They have a life of their own.
Different types of stone were quarried in different parts of the country. Basalts from Tahanga and the Coromandel, obsidian from Mare Island, argillite from D'Urville, and Pounamu from the South Island. New Zealand was a treasure trove for stone hunters. But Pounamu, greenstone, was more precious than all the others. Today, the Ngaitahu tribe still own and exploit their treasured Pounamu. The best stone is in the Arahura River in Westland. Micah Mason understands the value of this ancient stone.
Because of its spiritual and physical properties, Pounamu is of immense importance. For example, the Pounamu mere became the symbol of power and authority, and whoever held it held the rangatiratanga of the people.
South Island Maori set up a network of trails across mountains of snow and rivers of ice to extract the taonga and to trade it with Maori all over the country. These were some of the greatest trading trails the country has ever seen. They went right up the west coast of the South Island and across the high passes of the Southern Alps.
We traded Pounamu down here for waka, for finely woven mats, for a whole range of things. And we traded it for people, so you could trade lives with it. You see, so, you know, if you had prisoners or anything like that and you wanted them back, then you'd trade Pounamu for them.
Today, craftsmen like Turi Gibbs use tungsten and diamond-tipped blades to fashion both tourist mementos and works of art. Pre-European Maori had to evolve their own stoneworking techniques.
Maori developed this technique from watching the actions of the glaciers with the movement of ice and snow and gravel cutting great scarps in the landscape, and that provided them with an example and a method for cutting the hard Pounamu.
Maori used Pounamu for both tools and ornament. Pounamu carvers made some of the most beautiful objects ever fashioned in New Zealand. Maori society supported artisans with special skills like carving and weaving, as well as stoneworking. Such arts became the province of experts called tohunga. It was probably the first arrivals who discovered the wonderful properties of harakeke, the local flax that was used for everything from ropes to clothing.
One of the most important garments that they developed is this type of raincape. Each folded piece of leaf is fatued or finger-twined into the composition of the fabric. This is the rainproof garment that everybody would have had, and when Cook's people came, they said that when the Maori were wearing these and sitting down, they looked like little haystacks.
Maori weavers were able to make cloaks that were extremely soft and fine.
It's hard to describe how beautifully soft these sort of things can be, but I think you can tell by the flexibility that they could make it do what they wanted.
When he arrived in New Zealand, Captain Cook said Maori looked very Greek or Roman. Patricia has experimented with tying techniques to get the soft drapes depicted by Cook's artists. Maori clothing was simple. While the naked breast was acceptable, both sexes wore maro, aprons made of flax. But the battleground was no place for modesty, and the warriors stripped for battle wearing just a tatua, a padded belt. But there was still room for style. Maori used every kind of bird feather to adorn themselves, especially in their hair.
Well, there were two materials that are used in hairdressing. Red ochre was sometimes used with titoki oil, which was the most prestigious oil you could get, and they were mixed together as a paste to use in the hair and sometimes for decorating the body.
Hair was important for Maori because the head and everything associated with it was sacred, tapu.
Hair cutting in traditional Maori society was a really tricky business. Whoever cut your hair had to be of sufficient mana and status that they weren't going to be hurt by the tapu from you.
When combs like this were broken, they couldn't just be thrown away. They had to be carefully disposed of so they would not cause harm. Maori society was hierarchical, with rangatira and tohunga at the top and slaves taken in battle at the bottom. Rangatira and tohunga were sometimes so tapu, so sacred, that they could not touch food, since food and the utensils that touched it were noa, common, and could defile mana. Women were also noa and were banned from certain activities, hunting for instance. Some things like giving birth could be tapu or noa.
Depended on who the woman was, the status. It could be either tapu or noa when giving birth. But what strikes me as interesting is they didn't label the act of sexual intercourse as either tapu or noa. There's no label attached to it. So it probably was a bit of both.
Over hundreds of years of storytelling, the explanations of where people came from, the human and superhuman ancestors, were woven together in rich tribal traditions of folklore, song, and art. The base for all these stories is whakapapa, ancestry.
A family story. It's not just a genealogy. It's prominent people within the whānau from which I descend, and with each name goes a history.
Honeka from Rangatukia on the east coast can trace his genealogy all the way back through the gods to the moment of creation. On the way, he includes a demigod or two.
According to us in Rangitukia, we can trace ourselves directly to Maui Tiki Ataranga. And this is the Maui who fished the North Island out of the sea. There are a whole host of stories that go with him. He's the Maui who captures the sun. He brings fire to humanity. I mean, this is the kind of person that Maui becomes, almost demigodish.
Claiming demigod status for ancestors was part of talking up the importance of one's hapu in an increasingly competitive Maori society. And as populations grew, tribes evolved, and competition for precious resources intensified. Tangata whenua would turn to Tu, god of war. Tribal identity based on whakapapa shaped the conflicts that increased dramatically as population pressures grew. A proverb says, "Over women and land, men die."
Siblings of rank would argue and develop armies around each other, and then there'd be a split. And this often led to the new sub-tribes being developed when a chief's children fought. And those were the worst wars. They were the most bitter wars.
Peter Sharples and his son Paora train urban Maori in the traditional skills of the Maori warrior. A martial art in its own right, skill at fighting was one test of a person's mana.
The mana is the accrued respect that is given to that person by that person's society. So while you might be the son of a chief, you begin well with your mana, the mana of your father, and so on. But it soon disappears if you don't walk the talk and attract the support.
Women could have so much mana that men were afraid of them.
There was an ancestor of ours called Hine Matioro, a very powerful woman. So powerful, she chose the men that she bedded with. And no man dared turn her down, even if he was married. And if she wanted him, she just pointed him out and said, "Here." And he did as he was told.
Mana wasn't the only spiritual force related to battle. There was another law that ensured armed conflict remained hugely important for Maori, the concept of utu. Utu was more than just revenge. It was reciprocity, the return of like with like. In a tribal world without a police force, utu was the principle that kept balance in society.
Those laws were like the police. And so if you broke one of those laws, the community would exact payment or punishment or revenge, depending on what you did. You know, if you understand that, then one understands how possessions went from person to person. Land went from iwi to iwi, hapu to hapu. That Maori don't have a word for own. We never owned anything in the sense of, this is yours, you can go to the grave with it.
Possessions, including land, could only be held as long as they could be defended. The law of utu demanded that hospitality be returned with hospitality, and injury with equal or greater injury until a balance had been restored. Utu had to be sought, even if it took years. Feuds could last generations.
And I know of one that was 5 generations before the utu was sought. And it was in the modern generation that it happened, where the 5 generations ago, the younger brother killed the older cousin and decapitated him. And 5 generations, the reverse happened in exactly the same fashion. And it was said among this family that utu was there in suspension, just waiting for the moment when it would be fulfilled.
Mana is essential to another ritual of warfare, the eating of the vanquished.
It was a means of consuming the mana of someone else. And the more brutal you were to your enemy, and the eating of the flesh of your enemy was a means of diminishing the mana of the other and enhancing your own. Because for generations afterwards, when these people came within view, their descendants came within view, you could pick between your teeth and look at them, and they'd understand what the symbol was. Your ancestor was one time sustenance for their belly.
Cannibalism, people don't like this, but it existed all over the world and in early societies. And often, a lot of it was related to a shortage of meat, of actual protein in the diet and so on. So it was not uncommon for a war party to have some slaves on the hoof, if you like, as meat.
While warfare was central to Maori life, one group chose to abandon the practice altogether. They became known as Moriori and lived on the Chatham Islands, hundreds of kilometers east of the mainland. They called their islands Rekohu. They were not, as many believed, a separate race who were here before Maori. Sometime in the 14th or 15th century, a group of Maori left mainland New Zealand and never returned. Why they left, we don't know. But on these desolate, windswept islands where horticulture was difficult, they remained hunter-gatherers, dependent on fish, seals, and seabirds. They survived by protecting their bird and fish food sources, and by castrating male babies to keep their numbers down. In a remarkable contradiction, they were also peace-loving people who refused to resort to war as a way of settling disputes. But their unswerving commitment to living without killing other adults would be their undoing. When they were invaded by mainland Maori in the 1830s, they were slaughtered. Their refusal to fight back resulted in near genocide. Over 500 years of isolation in New Zealand, the Polynesians had become Maori and had evolved a rich, new and sophisticated culture. By the time Captain Cook arrived, New Zealand's population was about 100,000, mostly in the North Island. The arts of carving, weaving, oratory and warfare were highly developed. Hunting and horticulture had been adapted to their new land. But soon, Maori would find their society challenged and their culture under threat. A new wave of colonists would bring new animals, new technology, new weapons, and new ideas that would shake the Maori world to its very foundations.
Frontier of Dreams continues at 7:30 next and every Saturday evening with encore screenings on Sunday mornings at 10. We've a Graham Greene masterpiece next, The End of the Affair on 1.
This program was brought to you with funding from New Zealand On Air.